In the latter half of the book of Numbers, we find the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. A prophet of Yahweh is summoned to help a group of foreign kings, and Yahweh himself grants the man permission to give advice. But Yahweh suddenly changes his mind and sends one of his agents, an angel with a flaming sword, to intercept Balaam on the road and kill him. This story has puzzled scholars for centuries, as Yahweh seems to change his mind repeatedly for no apparent reason. His actions in this story make no sense. This story of a prophet of Yahweh who is given permission from God, but is then ambushed on the road by one of God's own agents, is strange enough when we first encounter it. But what's even stranger is that it happens again. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. We continue our study of the first book of Kings, which began in the last episode. If you haven't already listened to episode 60, you may want to do that first before continuing. We left off in chapter 11 with the end of Solomon's reign, but there were a few passages that we skipped. To understand the brief section that was skipped, we must backtrack a bit into the time of David. Why? Because chapter 11 backtracks. When David was on the warpath, he invaded Edom and attempted to execute all the male children so that the only people who would remain would be virgin girls who could then be taken by the Israelites. I don't need to tell you why they would keep the girls. One of the boys, named Ader, escaped David's genocide and fled to Egypt, where he found favor with the Pharaoh and would later marry the Pharaoh's sister-in-law, Thecamina. Many years later, when Ader learned of David's death, he felt it was safe to return to Edom. I suppose David had implemented a complex tracking system for all the Edomites and would have been alerted by text message if Ader's GPS tracking chip crossed into the Promised Land. So Ader entered Edom in order to take control of the nation following David's death. Yahweh then raised up Ader as an enemy of Solomon because of Solomon's paganism. So genocide is okay, but offering tribute to Yahweh's wife is not. Got it. After this brief reference to Ader being an enemy of Solomon, he disappears. I'm guessing this was the beginning of a longer story involving conflict between Israel and Edom, which wasn't included. We're then told about someone else who was set up by Yahweh to cause trouble for Solomon. Jeroboam, one of Solomon's servants, was visited by a prophet who tore his garments into 12 pieces to indicate the 12 tribes of Israel, and handed 10 to Jeroboam. This meant that Jeroboam would rule over the 10 northern tribes, leaving only 2 for Solomon's descendants. Of course, Solomon didn't take kindly to his servant coming into possession of the torn fabric and wanted to kill the man, so Jeroboam followed Ader's footsteps and fled to Egypt until Solomon's death. I think he would have just hopped north into Israel and taken control of the 10 tribes there since, Yahweh had just handed him control of the nation. If this sounds familiar, Yahweh choosing a new king which prompts the old king to begin hunting him, that's because it's the story of David and Saul. It's quite possible this is one folktale that's being applied to 2 different groups of characters. After that, Solomon died and his son Rehoboam succeeded him on the throne. This is to set up for the division of the land into 2 distinct kingdoms. But why does the author feel the need to first claim that the 2 nations were united, only to have them separate again? Remember that this story is not based on actual history. Israel and Judah were 2 distinct nations at this time. The idea of a united kingdom was a later invention, likely motivated by political necessity to justify the annexation of Israel. By presenting a story of a grand dynasty and united kingdoms, the new rulers could claim that they were returning Israel and Judah to a forgotten golden age instead of just conquering a land and imposing their rule. So They need a united kingdom to return to in order to justify the annexation of Israel by the southern kingdom of Judah. And of course, it must ultimately crumble and split in order to explain why the two kingdoms are separate prior to the annexation. So chapter 11 attempts to explain why Israel and Judah are separate kingdoms and blames it on the old style of worship. In chapter 12, Solomon's son Rehoboam was sent to Shechem to celebrate his enthronement, and Jeroboam came over from Israel asking if he could be welcomed back. Rehoboam wasn't sure, so he told Jeroboam to return in 3 days for his answer. Rehoboam then asked his advisers. The older man told him to show kindness to Jeroboam, but the younger advisers had something else to say on the matter. They said that Rehoboam should flog the man. There were also insults concerning the size of the man's penis. He followed the advice of the younger crowd and rejected Jeroboam. So all of the northern tribes were displeased and sided with their new king, leaving only 2 tribes for Rehoboam to rule. And so the northern and southern kingdoms were now divided. Rehoboam, not happy with the split that he had decided to cause, gathered all the soldiers of Judah and Benjamin, totaling 180,000 men. Now at this time, the entire population of Judah, including women, children, elderly, and men who weren't combatants, would have been a tiny fraction of that number. Estimates for the population of Jerusalem during this time stand between 1 and 2,000, and the entire nation harboring perhaps 20,000 people. The population began to expand after the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and thousands of refugees fled south. But prior to that, Judah was a quite sparsely populated region. So Rehoboam began marching toward the much larger, more powerful, and more technologically advanced nation of Israel, but was confronted by the prophet Shemaiah, who instructed him to turn back, and so the army did. Meanwhile, Jeroboam feared that if his people in Israel went south to Judah in order to worship in Jerusalem, they might turn away from his nation. So he set up golden calves to be worshipped as Yahweh in the cities of Dan and Bethel, and set priests at each site, and even established festivals on the 15th day of the 8th month. 2 important details here. In reverse order, we have an etiological tale explaining the origin of shrines, altars, and festivals. The other and more important detail is the notion of Yahweh being worshipped as a golden calf. If you recall from our episodes concerning the book of Exodus, it was Yahweh himself who formed the molten gold into the image of a calf, which was then worshipped by Aaron and the Israelites. This wasn't an instance of the Israelites turning from Yahweh and thereby being punished for it, but a reference to the older form of worship that involved statues and images of the gods, such as a golden calf to represent Yahweh. Later, this form of worship would be condemned, and so stories were invented to condemn the practice, such as the tale of Aaron and the golden calf in Exodus. Remember the previous episode where metal bulls were part of the Jerusalem temple. This was acceptable Yahweh worship at one point. One such attempt to disrupt worship at the local shrines and centralize worship in the Jerusalem temple was the reform of Josiah, in which priests who operated these shrines were killed and the altars taken down. This would supposedly transpire in the mid-7th century BCE, and in chapter 13, the author actually references this event, demonstrating once again that this is a text from a much later date than the events it describes. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, is at the shrine outside of Bethel when a prophet of Yahweh strolls up and declares that a descendant of David named Josiah will eventually be born, and he will slaughter the priests of these shrines and burn their bones. This raises the question, why would Yahweh name Jeroboam to the throne if he was against Jeroboam and his style of worship? Remember that, like Saul, David, and Solomon, Jeroboam was hand-chosen by Yahweh to rule. and some of these shrines were erected at Yahweh's instruction, such as the altars that Abraham installed. In the story, Jeroboam commanded his followers to seize the man and pointed at him, but Yahweh froze his arm in place. Fearful as to what might occur next, Jeroboam begged to be released from the magic arm lock. So the man stepped aside and spoke with Yahweh, who was presumably present at this meeting, and the king of Israel was then released. So the king invited the prophet to his home to eat and drink with him. But the priest declined, stating that Yahweh specifically instructed him to do no such thing. After this, he departed and began his journey back to Bethel. I can't help but wonder if this is meant to be similar to Lot and his family being commanded to not look back. When Yahweh gives one an instruction, it should be followed immediately and to the letter, and one should show no signs of hesitation or regret. To illustrate the severity of the matter, we're treated to tales in which someone as important as Yahweh's own chosen instruments fail in some minor way and are severely punished for the offense. In the case of Lot, his wife looked back at the city of Sodom and Yahweh turned her into a pillar of salt. In this case, well, we'll soon see. So the strange man departed for Bethel, but he took his sweet time. This gave a prophet living in Bethel time to learn of the recent events and ride off to find this mysterious man of God sitting beneath a terebinth tree. If that sounds familiar, it's because sitting beneath trees, often terebinth trees, was part of the job of a prophet. They'd sit and listen to the rustling of the leaves and attempt to hear the voice of God in the white noise. Similar to how ghost hunters today listen to static while asking questions and imagine they hear spirits giving answers. And this tree wasn't just called a terebinth tree, but it is referred to here in chapter 13 as the terebinth tree, meaning there was likely a specific tree halfway between the town of Bethel and its hilltop shrine that was a popular spot for prophets to conduct this practice. And this specific tree was first mentioned in Genesis 35:8 as the burial place for Deborah, the handmaid of Rebekah. And in this same area near Bethel, another Deborah, the prophetess and leader of Israel from Judges 4, sat beneath a tree to speak with Yahweh. See episode 30. Anyway, the prophet from Bethel found the strange man who had confronted Jeroboam and invited the man back to town for dinner. But the stranger again said that he was to refuse such invitations. The prophet was so adamant that he lied to the stranger and claimed that an angel of God had instructed him to bring the stranger to his home in Bethel. The stranger fell for the deception and followed the prophet back to his house for dinner. After the meal, the Spirit of Yahweh entered the lying prophet's mouth and declared that the stranger would die for his disobedience and would not be buried with his fathers. Upon leaving the prophet's house, riding the prophet's ass, the stranger was killed by a lion. But we're told that the donkey was unharmed. The lion only killed the disobedient man, and not the ass, to demonstrate that it was sent by Yahweh. This won't be the last time in the books of Kings that Yahweh sends animals to kill people who displease him. And this scene of a man sent by Yahweh to deliver a message, but is then ambushed on the road by one of Yahweh's agents, is oddly familiar. It's strangely reminiscent to the story of Balaam and his talking ass in the book of Numbers. Something very odd is going on in this scene and the scene of Balaam, and I'm not sure what it is or why it's happening, but I will be digging into this topic further. Even after all of this transpired, King Jeroboam didn't turn from his evil ways. He continued to erect shrines devoted to Yahweh, just as everyone before him for thousands of years had done, committing an act that wouldn't actually be a crime until several centuries after his death. And chapter 13 ends by stating that this is the reason his house was eventually wiped out. The next section of First Kings deals with the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Jeroboam, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, had a son who fell sick, so he dispatched his wife to Shiloh to consult a prophet. The prophet was blind and couldn't see who was visiting him, but Yahweh whispered into his ear, telling him the woman's identity and purpose for her visit. He repeats the words Yahweh gave to him, stating that Jeroboam was chosen by Yahweh to inherit Israel, but disappointed and offended God by making metal idols. Because of this, his house will be destroyed completely. All of his family members who die in town will be eaten by dogs, and all who die in the countryside will be eaten by birds. He then tells Jeroboam's wife to return home, and as soon as she sets foot into her town, her son will die. Now, it's important to point out here that Jeroboam is being punished for not worshiping Yahweh properly, and the punishment is to kill his son, who, according to the text, is worshiping Yahweh properly. Doesn't seem fair for the kid. Yahweh also states that he is now raising up a new king who will replace Jeroboam. This king, as we'll see in the next chapter, is the son of the prophet delivering the dire warning. We're then told that the nation of Israel will be scattered and taken to Mesopotamia because of their use of sacred posts. These are decorative poles and were a part of the temple complex, though later worshippers rejected their use in the post-Babylonian period. Jeroboam's wife returned home, and as soon as she entered town, her son died. We then see a curious passage that will appear again and again throughout this book. It states that the other events of Jeroboam's reign are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel. This is a reference to a record book concerning the procession of kings. Such books were common in the ancient world and preserved details such as the dates of the king's birth, death, important marriages, military campaigns, significant building projects, etc. The inclusion of this passage here and at the end of each king's story in this book tells us two things. First, it tells us this book is using the Annals of the Kings as source material for some of its information. The second thing it tells us is that this book, the Book of Kings, as it is found in the Bible, is meant to be an expansion to the Annals of the Kings. Most of what we'll see in this book is designed to paint the kings in a negative light, detailing why they're all horrible people who deserve to be eaten by dogs and be cursed by Yahweh. Hardly the type of material you would expect to find. In fact, if you read this entire section of 1 Kings, it contains virtually no information about any of the kings. Each chapter states that a new king rose to power and died, and was a filthy idolater along the way. It's as if this book is saying, I know you've read the official story in the Annals of the Kings, but let me tell you the real story. It's the Reformers' way of blaming the old religion for Israel's eventual destruction at the hands of the Assyrians, and Judah's eventual destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. So Jeroboam ruled for 22 years and then died and was buried with his fathers. This verse apparently was copied straight from the Annals of the Kings of Israel, as it has no awareness of the curse mentioned a few verses earlier that stated that no member of the household would be buried, which lends further weight to the idea that the Annals of the Kings was being used as a source, but this text is meant to argue against the accomplishments of the royalty by penning random stories about their idolatry and precious little else. Back in the southern kingdom of Judah, Solomon's son Rehoboam was king, and he reigned for 17 years. But like his northern neighbor, he too built shrines, pillars, and sacred posts on hilltops and beneath trees. Also, there were male prostitutes in the land, and all of this meant that the Israelites were engaging in the same practices as the people who had once inhabited the land. Now, since the Israelites were not actually a distinct ethnic group from the earlier Canaanites, and the Exodus and subsequent conquest never actually happened, they're not actually talking about separate people who inhabited Israel. They're speaking of their own ancestors. And this means that one of the things the post-exilic reformers were trying to expunge from their religion was sacred prostitution. So that used to be part of Judaism. As part of Yahweh's punishment for Judah, he sent King Shishak of Egypt against Jerusalem during Rehoboam's 5th year as king. This Egyptian was the brother-in-law to the Egyptian princess that Jeroboam married. He carried away the treasures of the temple and the royal palace. This man, Shishak, is believed to be the pharaoh Shoshenq I, who carried out a successful campaign in Canaan around 925 BCE. Now that the Egyptian has been used by Yahweh to punish the chosen people, he returns to his land successful, and the text tells us that Rehoboam was constantly at war with Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. Eventually, he died and was buried in Jerusalem. Of course, Rehoboam's deeds are recorded in a book called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. He is succeeded by his son Abijam, who only ruled for 3 years. He, of course, continued being a heathen, which further displeased Yahweh. He was also at war with the northern kingdom and then died, and his deeds are also recorded in the Annals of the Kings of Judah. His son Asa became king for the next 41 years. Now this is strange. Chapter 15 tells us that Abijam's mother was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. Then, a few verses later, when it tells us about his son Asa, it says that his mother is Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Did Abijam have sex with his mother? The Apostle Paul would certainly have something to say about that. While this is certainly possible, I think it's actually a copyist error. It seems likely to me that a scribe looked up at the wrong line when copying the information about Asa's mother. He accidentally glanced up too far and copied the information about Abijam's mother instead. Asa was a bit better than his heathen ancestors and expelled the male prostitutes. He removed his mother as queen, whomever she may have actually been, and took down the idols and the Asherah poles his mother had erected. They were burned in the Kidron Valley. This event is duplicated in 2 Kings 26:6. It seems they have multiple versions of the story of cleansing the Holy Land, and it is attributed to various people. It also states that he brought all the treasures back to Yahweh's house. This makes no sense, as the treasures were located in Egypt. But since the looting of the temple was more theological than history, it's likely they had multiple versions of this event as well. It is also, after all, meant to foreshadow the destruction of the Babylonians. So this may be a reference to someone else stealing the temple treasures and Asa fetching them back. Asa then sent the treasures to King Ben-Hadad in Damascus as a bribe. So he's not actually returning Yahweh's stuff, but more of using it to pay off his enemies. In this case, he has a bunch of Assyrians break their alliance with the northern kingdom of Israel and lay waste to the land. So in a way, the author is attempting to give credit for the Assyrian conquest to the land of Judah. Sometime later, when Asa was old, his foot became infected and he died. His son Jehoshaphat succeeded him as king. Meanwhile, up in Israel, Jeroboam's son Nadab became king, but only for a couple of years, and of course, he did what was displeasing to Yahweh, which means he was worshiping Yahweh in the old fashion and not the new. So while he was besieging a city, Baasha betrayed and murdered him. Now, who is Baasha? I'm glad you asked. Remember when Jeroboam's son fell ill, so he sent his wife to a prophet for help? That prophet was named Ahijah, and his son was named Baasha. As soon as Baasha became king, he had all of Jeroboam's family put to death, fulfilling the prophecy that his father had uttered while Yahweh was using him like a sock puppet in the previous chapter. He ruled for 24 years, but also displeased Yahweh, despite being hand-selected by the God to rule the land. This meant that Baasha also had to be disposed of, so Yahweh spoke to a prophet named Jehu. Jehu promised to destroy Baasha's house, and we get a repeat of the curse we saw earlier. Anyone who dies in town will be eaten by dogs, and anyone who dies in the countryside will be devoured by birds. But immediately after pronouncing this curse, the editor seems to have forgotten and reverts to the original narrative in which Baasha simply dies and is buried, and his son Elah inherits the throne of Israel. 2 years later, Zimri, his chariot officer, struck him down because the best way to punish Baasha is to kill his son 2 years after Baasha's death. Zimri then killed the rest of Baasha's house, all of his relatives, and even their friends. Pretty much he went all Kaiser Soze on him. Now Zimri, the chariot officer, enjoyed the absolute shortest rule in the entire book, a mere week. When the army learned of his treachery, they named their commander Omri as the new king, and Omri laid siege to the city where Zimri was hiding. Zimri's response was to set fire to his own palace and go up in flames. But because the redactor really needs to paint every king in a negative light, Zimri also displeased Yahweh and somehow caused all of Israel to sin, even though the entire nation had turned against him the instant they heard he had set himself up as king. And then we get the absurd statement that's found at the end of each of the king's stories, that the rest of the details of his reign can be found in the annals of the king. Like what, exactly? The man hopped on the throne, was instantly besieged, and died in the span of a week. None of the nation followed him, and he spent his entire reign besieged. I'm surprised the author managed to fill out an entire paragraph with that information. How is there more in another book? This just provides another example of how this entire narrative, as it's presented in the Book of Kings, makes little sense unless it is meant to be an addition or a rebuttal to the source material. Omri was then challenged by a man named Tibni, son of Gibnath, but Omri's commander of the army ensured his victory. We're told that Omri reigned 12 years, and during that time he brought the hill of Samaria and built the town of Samaria on top of it, giving us an etiological tale for the city's origins. However, archaeology shows us that this location was actually settled during the 11th century BC, centuries before King Omri lived. He was, however, responsible for significant expansion at the site, including a massive palace constructed there, which happens to be the largest monument dating to the Iron Age in this region. During his time and subsequent dynasty, called the Omri dynasty, marked a time of significant expansion for the Kingdom of Israel. New roads were built, cities were fortified, and defenses were erected. They seem to operate during a time of great conflict, as many of the cities saw significant increase to their fortifications during this period, including the 6-chambered gates that would later be attributed to King Solomon in 1 Kings 9:15. Remember in the last episode when I said that Solomon was given credit for building projects that happened centuries later? Omri was one of the kings who actually was responsible for many of those projects. His military campaigns also placed Moab under his boot. They even mention him and his oppression on the Mesha stele, making him one of only a handful of Israelite kings who were attested outside of the Bible. His descendants continued this mission of oppressing Moab, earning them a spot on the monument as well. This dynasty would ultimately fall to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, but prior to this, the Omri dynasty would have been perhaps the most impressive time period in Israel's history, with unparalleled production of wine and olive oil, breeding of horses and building of stables, fielding a massive chariot army, and expanding their borders into neighboring territories. But none of this is mentioned in the Bible. It tells us only that Omri built a town and worshipped false gods and displeased Yahweh more than all of his predecessors. After that, he died, and his son Ahab succeeded him as king. Of course, the reason none of this is mentioned here is because those details are in the source material, the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Then the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen happened. King Ahab of Israel got married to a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. Daughter of King Ithobal I, a name which means with Baal, she of course led Ahab astray and caused him to worship other gods. Though we should point out that every king before him had already been guilty of that same crime, so maybe it's just what the author had decided for all the kings of Israel. But the editors of these stories need to use foreign women as a scapegoat in order to warn their contemporaries against the practice of worshiping anyone other than Yahweh and of mingling with foreign women. So Jezebel converts her husband, the king of Israel, to Baal worship, and because of this, he constructs a temple to Baal in Samaria and erected sacred posts, also known as Asherah poles. This is to give an explanation for the presence of such things in the city of Samaria. Baal and Asherah worship were common in the land of Israel, and not just in the Bronze Age, but continuing into Christian times. We'll discuss King Ahab and the wicked Princess Jezebel in the next episode when we finish off 1 Kings and cover the stories of Elijah and Elisha. But before we wrap this up, we have one final tidbit at the end of 1 Kings chapter 16 to discuss. During the reign of King Ahab, a man from Bethel named Hiel decided to rebuild the walls of Jericho that had been destroyed so many centuries earlier when Joshua besieged the city. We're told in the final verses of this chapter that he began the construction project by sacrificing his firstborn son, Abiram, in order to lay the foundations, and his youngest son, Segub, in order to build the gates. But why would he do that? And who did Hiel sacrifice his children to? According to the text, he did this because it was commanded by Yahweh. If we hop back to episode 27 and the story of Joshua's invasion of Canaan, we find the story of Jericho's destruction. At the end of that portion of the tale, in Joshua 6:26, Yahweh decrees that anyone who attempts to build the walls of a city or its gates must first sacrifice one of their children. We first encountered this idea when Cain killed his brother Abel before building the world's first city. This was an ancient practice that was common throughout the Mediterranean world, Israel included. To begin a great project, one must first pay their god in blood. The Creator must sacrifice in order to create, the same way that El Elyon had to sacrifice his son Jesus in order to build his new kingdom. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wishlist in the pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis, and you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsandgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsandgenesis podcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site over at dragonsandgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.